I need to record this session and then continue. So I'm going to give out a disclaimer now. To ensure clarity and transparency, we would like to outline the following disclaimer regarding the content that will be shared during this webinar. The opinions and views expressed by the panelists during the webinars are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of TPPA or the organizations they represent. The information provided in this webinar is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not intended as professional advice or as substitute for professional consultation. In addition to this session, it's being recorded and we will share it on our social media platforms. So if you do not wish to be seen, please keep your camera off and audios off as well. When we come to the Q&A session, of course, we'll stop recording so that people can ask questions freely. So now I'll reintroduce myself because I missed that on the recording. My name is Josephine Nshunju, and I'm a representative of TPPA. Now I would like to introduce our panelists by their names and their professional titles, but I'll give them the opportunities to introduce themselves further and share with us what it is that they do. You have the comfortability to share as much or as little as you want. So on our panel today, we have three distinguished guests. The first one is Dr. Nancy Adosi. She's a migration advising expert. The second one is Mr. Paul Bomani. He's the CEO of ID Tech. And the third is Cephas Joseph Moore. He's a technical privacy advocate. So to start with, I would like to invite Dr. Nancy to introduce herself, and then followed by Mr. Paul Bomani, and lastly, Cephas, and then we can start the discussion. Welcome. And feel free to turn on your.
Hello, thank you so much for the welcome. My name is Dr. Nancy Adosi. I am a migration development expert, and particularly looking at the intersection of migration and identity, especially when we're talking about identity in the sense of privacy and the rights that migrants have when moving about the continent or even moving from continent to continent. Other than that, my background is in political science, public administration, and health sciences policy, and I'm grateful to be here. I'll stop here and leave it for the next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I welcome Paul Bomani next?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks, Josephine. Great to be here. As introduced, my names are Paul Bomani. I am dialing in from Zanzibar, CEO of ID Tech. Our brand name is Yes ID, and we focus on digital identity verification, doing background checks, and ultimately establishing trust for different actors in digital spaces. And so be it businesses, be it individuals. I look forward to having a great discussion today.
Thank you. And lastly, I would like to invite Cephas. I hope I'm saying your name right. Is it Cephas? Okay. Hello, Cephas. We can't hear you.
Hello.
Hello, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Super. Good afternoon, everyone. Morning, evening, night. This is Cephas Joseph Mwana. I am dialing in from a small town outside of Nairobi, Kenya. I am excited to be here to talk about digital ID, privacy, security, everything related. Looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for making the time to be here and for offering your knowledge and expertise in this area. So to start off, I'm going to start with the most basic question. As most of us already know, the area of data protection is still very new for Tanzanians. And I don't want to assume that people understand what we mean when we talk of biometric data or when we talk of digital IDs. So can I ask Dr. Nancy to briefly explain to our audience what is biometric data, and give us a couple of examples, and why is biometric data related to digital identities, so people can get an understanding of what we are talking about.
Apologies, I'm having some technical issues, so I'm going to leave my camera off until I can fix it.
All right.
So, yes, sorry. So when we're talking about biometric data, we're referring to unique physical and or behavioral characteristics that are used to identify individuals. So in migration, for example, we use biometrics to enhance security and efficiency by actually providing reliable methods for identity verification. I've seen some governments use biometric systems to manage their immigration systems, to secure identity documents, and also to prevent fraud. For instance, an example of biometric data can be fake fingerprinting or facial recognition technologies, which are commonly used to authenticate identities at borders. Recently, I can mention that, okay, here it is. Sorry. Recently, I can mention that one of the biometric data that we're seeing a lot of countries collect is actually DNA. So we've seen a lot of for sure, United States of America, some countries in Europe are also collecting swabs inside the cheeks. So we've seen a lot of advancement from just fingerprinting to collecting DNA. And the reasoning behind that, I can mention for the United States, is that they want to make sure that they run these DNA samples by whatever samples they have in their criminal record system. So that's what I can start off with. I hope that's okay, and then I'll leave it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that brief introduction and explanation. And just to add on a bit, because you mentioned the United States, I was watching a documentary the other day, a criminal documentary, and they were talking about how now they're able to use DNA to create a profile, like a physical appearance of the assailant. So that's where we are heading with biometric, that one day they can use your DNA that has been collected at a crime scene and use that to formulate, a picture of the race of the person. Was it a man or a female? How potentially, how do they look like, their facial features? So it's becoming very, very interesting as we go along. Mr. Bomani and Keifas, do you want to add to what Dr. Nancy has said, or should we move on? Feel free if you have anything to add.
Yeah. So the only thing I want to add is I think especially in our context, when people think biometrics, they're always thinking about fingerprints. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad that Dr. Nancy expanded that biometrics is a lot broader. When it comes to establishing or verifying someone's identity, there's usually like 3 methods that are used. So one is what a person knows. So this could be a password, a one-time PIN. The second method is what a person has. So a person could have a physical credential like an ID card, or something that's been issued by a credential issuing authority. And by virtue of having that card, it's a way to verify that they are the rightful person. And then the third one is what you are. So biometrics. And I think when it comes to this discussion, biometrics and security is of utmost importance, because it's what you are. You can't change that. So if someone clones your fingerprint, unlike what you know and what you have, which are easily replaceable, biometrics are it is who you are. So replacing that is a bit of a challenge. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Keifas, do you have anything to add, or should I proceed?
Absolutely. Another category of biometrics we need to think about, and this one is always left out a lot, is behavioral attributes, right? So things like your kawaii, sorry, I'm almost speaking Swahili.
It's okay,
Things
we
like
can translate.
yeah, so things like your kawaida signature, your keystroke patterns, and other just behavioral characteristics. Those things can, in a way, build patterns. These patterns can be then used to profile you based on this behavioral. And even if you narrow it down to data protection and consider the various types of personal data, behavioral data is actually one of the categories beyond your usual ordinary personal data or sensitive data. We have a whole set of behavioral attributes, which by extension you could think about, your likes on social media or whatever platforms, things you hate, you indicate those by various digital signals, for example. So all of those things can, from a behavioral perspective, can, in a sense, be then used to uniquely, because the essence of biometric is, one essence of biometric is uniqueness, right? This data can be uniquely sort of be tied back to your identity. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, so I would like us to move on. Dr. Nancy, you have told us in your introduction that you work with migration. So could you briefly maybe give us an overview of how biometric data is used, when it comes to migration, so people can get a practical view of how potentially their biometric data is being used when they're migrating, maybe from one place to another, from one country to another. Can you just briefly give us your experience there?
Yes, I can. So I can start off by saying that biometric data serves a lot of member states in the African Union as well as elsewhere in confirming who it is that's actually applying. So oftentimes you'll see that when countries are letting migrants in, they're collecting, as I said, fingerprinting, they're collecting other biometric data, and it's meant to triangulate the person's identity. So they usually compare it with other countries' information. So some countries have an agreement in between each other to share those biometric data. The biggest example I can give, just because I'm from that area, is Canada and the United States. They often share biometric data to triangulate and reaffirm who it is that who the migrant is. So that's how most countries use biometric data. Another way that they use biometric data is by cross-referencing it with, and we're seeing this more often with banking and healthcare. Especially with the advent of COVID, as you all remember, that's something that they were collecting when they were swabbing inside the nose and swabbing inside the throat. In some cases, some countries kept that DNA data because, again, remember, they were sometimes swabbing inside the throat. So that is now being cross-referenced as well in terms of migration. We've seen this more in like the advanced levels of how should I say it, of tracking patients and tracking where some of the health scares are starting from. So that's just to give you a few examples. The other thing I wanted to mention is, and I think this might be happening in China, but it's not just, I like to call it tangible biometric data. So for example, your saliva is tangible, your DNA is tangible. As my colleagues have mentioned, there's also behavior. And by behavior, it's not just like, what do you normally do? It's your gait as well. Like, are you normally looking to the left, to the right? Like, what are you normally doing? So we're also seeing a lot of that type of very specific biometric data being collected as well.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. And it's a bit scary, but also understandable. I understand it from the perspective of, let's say, security. There's a lot of crime going on, and you want to make it easy to identify the assailants. I understand that. And for health reasons, I understand collection of biometric for health reasons, but now we see it, more common in the production of national identifications as well. And I'm wondering, how relevant is that has it become a dilemma that people are faking their nationality, or why are we seeing this great move of countries wanting to have digital identities for their citizens as well? Do you have an idea there?
I have an idea, and the idea is a bit scary. Well, as with any type of biometric data collection is. The idea is basically to connect other important things. So for example, the move for digital identity and national identity based on digital identity is eventually what will happen is that we'll either have chips or we'll have our identities
RFI?
that are accessed. Sorry, can you hear me?
Is it the ones called RFI chips?
Yeah, exactly. RFI chips. Yeah. But, right now we have those, some passports have those. I think the East African Community Passport has it now, but some passports have the chip. And what's eventually going to happen is that the chip will then move on to something like a phone or a very tiny watch. And then in some cases, as some people have seen, it can be implanted here as well. So we're moving the data online to basically get rid of paperwork, to ensure that people are easier to track. And then also another thing that I wanted to point out is that for some of us who do our taxes online, for example, even that data can be connected to your identity. So it's more of a move towards compiling data on each citizen so that it's easier to track each citizen, whether you're in Panama or you're in South Africa. If I have your your biometric data and I'm able to put in the database, I can find out the last time you paid taxes. I can find out the last time you went for, a health checkup. All of those things is so that countries are able to very easily, track their citizens. And you're probably wondering, why would they want to track me? Well, honestly, they want you to pay your taxes, which is where every country is moving towards. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I think our audience are learning a lot about biometric data collection as well as digital identities. Now I'm going to move to Paul. So coming to the situation in Tanzania, and as someone that is working, with digital IDs, can you give us your experience on how businesses in Tanzania, using biometric authentication, or how can they use this new technology, and how best can they ensure that this data, that this sensitive personal data that is being collected by them is secured to it? Because the more the sensitive the data, the higher the protection that is needed around the data. So can you give us your experience and your advice, since this is your area?
Sure. So if you look at Tanzania, there's first, if we look at the current usage in the market, there's, I would say, two main categories of institutions in the private sector. So one is regulated institutions, and most of these regulated institutions are capturing biometric because the law says that they have to, or the regulator says they have to verify their customers using biometric data. And the source of truth for verification is NIDA. So they all have to verify against NIDA. So here you see the telcos who, for SIM registration, have to use fingerprints to verify individuals. Within NIDA's policy, they make it clear that they should not store fingerprints. So the MNOs are technically supposed to destroy the biometric data after matching with NIDA. To be frank, whether there's actual controls to verify that that data is destroyed after verification is a separate matter, but that is what the law says. Then you have your financial sector, such as banks. Banks have a bit more leeway. They just have to verify against NIDA. So there's different methods that they could use. So one is fingerprint. NIDA also has other ways to verify information. So one is security questions. And then the other one is an OTP, which is sent to the mobile number that was used or that's in the customer's data subject's information that's needed. Now, a lot of banks opt to forego the fingerprint method because it requires infrastructure investment. They have to put fingerprint scanners and things like that. So they usually fall back to security questions, which in my view is not the best way to verify people, because most of the questions are quite generic. Your family member can probably answer 90% of the questions correctly. But in either case, they avoid cost by using security questions. And you have other industries like insurance, which don't really use it, although they're going to be mandated to with universal healthcare. So you have the regulated space where they literally do it because they're told they have to. Then you have the I guess the more unregulated closed loop deployments where companies collect biometrics for different regions. So we see things like companies using biometric for attendance tracking, where they have, where they store the fingerprints locally, and they govern how that information is stored internally based on their own internal policies. We have what I've seen is events also use biometrics such as face nowadays. So when you go to an event, after the event, you scan your face and it automatically shows you all the pictures. So it basically just shows you, or it aggregates all the pictures that you were in from that event, which is a very interesting use case. And then you have insurance companies who use that biometric at service providers, so most health facilities. So this would be your tier 1 health facilities, your big hospitals. You won't find this in the regional clinics, etc., where the insurance company will have a biometric verification, which will be stored locally, primarily to stop insurance fraud or to curb for insurance fraud. So some best practices from what we're seeing in the marketplace is, one, if you don't need to store biometric data, don't. Like if you're verifying against NIDA, so data minimalization. There's other trends in the market, such as things like biohashing biometric information, making sure you are storing the information in an encrypted fashion. Some platforms or some providers have their own proprietary encryption methods, which they also use for vendor lock-in. So you have to be cautious with the provider that you're using. Ultimately, I think when it comes to making sure the data is stored securely, there's all sorts of different technologies that are out there, but I fundamentally believe in just having, I think the biggest security risk in any organization is always user access or human-related risk. So yes, there's encrypt things, make sure you're using the best technologies, but I always start with what's your process for managing the people who have access to this data or this information? Because if you don't control that, then you can circumvent any technological, in my view, any technological implementation you can put to safeguard the information. So for me, I always believe start with the human side of things. How do people access, who has access to this information, as well as where possible, having an external auditor actually come in and do periodic audits of your entire platform and your data, because it's very hard to mark your own homework. So I think, let me stop there for now. And I'll add on as we go.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So is it safe to say that for the time being in Tanzania, at least, the use of biometric data it's still new and it's limited to more regulated, for more regulated industries, like you say, the financial sector, the health sector, and of course, government agencies? We already know that, they want, they've said mifumo isomane, So I understand in the government and the telecommunication, of course, where they've used that as the starting point to get everybody, to get registered and get the biometric ID. But like you say, do you foresee, this is just an additional question, do you foresee the use of biometric data expanding even further to the private sector? And do you think maybe the regulatory bodies should have some kind of guidelines when it comes to, you know, this level of expansion to non-regulated industries? Because I think it's quite risky if every entity, like you said, you're attending, there are a lot of events in Tanzania, and if every MC starts using this, you know, fancy tool where you can scan your face to see how many pictures of you were taken without knowing the security requirements behind collecting that kind of facial recognition tools. So do you have anything to add there?
Sure. So I think when it comes to my view of the market landscape right now, when it comes to KYC and why a lot of institutions do KYC, a lot of them do it because they have to. Either because they have to, or they're a loan issuing authority and they need to establish some level of traceability. So where the market is right now with, and this, we're talking about lenders, people who are lending money out. When it comes to traceability, the key question for them would be, if I capture a biometric information, will this really help me to trace this individual? So like the example Dr. Nancy used, where DNA is being used to match against legacy data to see if this person is in a criminal database, etc. If I'm a lender and I give you money and I have your fingerprint, where can I go that will give me assurance that it will help me to actually find you? So I think for that reason, when you look at the purpose for KYC in this market right now, the adoption of even things like biometrics is more of I have to, because the regulator has said so. And then you have your other cases of fraud prevention, in which you find like in the insurance industry, where you're trying to curb insurance fraud, and use cases of that sort where there's a beneficiary and you want to make sure that the service or the benefit has actually reached the intended beneficiary. So you see this in like pension systems, like when you're doing pension payouts, you see this in different subsidy programs like TASAF, where they want to distribute subsidies to low-income families and things like that. So it's those use cases where like the biometrics are required, but other than that, it's for other service providers, they see it as bothersome at this point in time.
Thank you for sharing that. Now I will move on to Kay first. So we've heard from Dr. Nancy. She has given us the use cases from an international perspective, like US and Canada. We've heard what kind of biometrics are collected in that aspect. We have an idea of the type of biometric data that is collected in Tanzania. Of course, it's mostly for the digital identity, and it's for the regulated industries. So can you please, from your experience in Kenya, could you provide an overview of how biometric data is leveraged within national identities and migration programs? Or just tell us what is the situation like in Kenya?
All right. So, first and foremost, it's nothing different from what Paul has said. I think those are very usual, typical use cases that have been there for biometrics for so long. Of course, one thing that I see keep changing is the context, right? But identification or authentication, those are good old foundational use cases for biometrics. Specifically for national security, I know one, of course, when you're going to get some official documents, they might pick your fingerprints, but of course, a lot of this is manual. So they'll, give you ink, press on the ink, press that ink back on a template document, and voila, they have picked your fingerprint, in a very manual way here. When you are thinking about passport acquisition, I know there's been a bit of digitization within the immigration offices. So there's a peak of digital fingerprints, which is then, of course, templated, and that is then associated, of course, with your ID. In terms of facial recognition, I hear about potential updates for migration. I think if you've been around, you've heard all the conversations we've been having around our, biggest or largest airport in Nairobi, and the drama and the corruption and everything around it. But of course, part of the plan really was, thinking about various upgrades, which might also have included smart identification that includes biometric at the various gates for entrance, exits, and all that. But it's a wait and see. Oh yeah, I can point something just top of my head for the private sector. Of course, our largest telco has, a while ago, they introduced a voice authentication capability where you can then use your voice. First, you register your voice, right? You register your voice to access, I think should have been M-Pesa. You register your voice there, they template it, and then you can then go ahead and use your voice to authenticate yourself, which in essence, generally, this is what we call passwordless authentication, right? So you have to key things in, figure out what you know and what you have. Of course, as Doc had said, that if at some point you are going to have these biometrics encoded in chips, then you will then have more or less like hardware tokens that have the biometric data, which is, of course, a different ballgame. But whether it's in your passport, whether it's in your national government issued ID, or any other useful token instrument, then that's another carrier really of how you can then use your biometric for that purpose. In a sense, that's what I would say from a broad perspective, but the usual use cases are there. Or maybe one of interest, now that Paul mentioned about insurance, and two things. One, of course, regulated industries. By law, by regulations, they have to do it at some point if they are demanded. In that case, of course, the question is then how do we ensure protection, for that data, which I think is it's a conversation we can have down the road. But the other side of the story is I have a hospital client these days that when I was doing an audit for them, I realized that they have an insurer. They have an insurer partner who actually requests for biometric authentication for when an insurance claim wants to be met. They have a patient. So of course they gave the hospital some biometric devices for that purpose. So it's a case of how then does the, of course, hospital be liable for whatever data that they're collecting at their premises biometric, and then what is the data relationship with the insurer in this case? But point to note is, at some point, some use cases can be a bit more, in my opinion, unusual. In some contexts, can be unusual. But some contents might make obvious sense that way. But hope that helps.
Thank you. Are you done?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I want us to now briefly, in the interest of time, Dr. Nancy, and then of course Paul and Kefas, you can jump in afterwards. From your experience, what are some of the challenges that you have seen when it comes to implementing, biometric data collection systems, or, implementing this digital identities in migration? What are some of the challenges?
Yeah, I can first start off by saying the biggest challenge we've seen is the cost of the infrastructure itself. One of my colleagues mentioned that banks cannot or don't like to use fingerprinting or things like that because it would require them to have the infrastructure to buy the fingerprinting reading machines and things like that. So we're seeing the same things happen even in the migration sector. The second challenge are technical challenges. So basically ensuring like the reliability of the data that is collected and ensuring that that data can actually be used, because if it's not very well collected, then you can't use it, you have to destroy it. The third one would be data security and privacy. Just in terms of what I've seen across the board, in terms of what I've seen in different countries when I visited, I can honestly say oftentimes the data is not secure. Oftentimes the data is not private. And this is coming from the perspective of someone who has visited these offices, and I can see what's on your screen. I can see that you're processing data about someone. And, if I wasn't, someone who is professional and working, I could very easily get that information and use that information on that person. So those are the three main challenges that I'm seeing. And also just in terms of, I mentioned it as the first one because it's always the main thing, but in terms of having a dedicated budget line within the government requires the government's perspective on collecting data. So if the government of the country is not really thinking about like, oh, we don't really need this stuff, we don't really need this infrastructure, then you won't see a lot of funding in that area. So I would say maybe a fourth one would technically be just ensuring that the government has buy-in as to what is needed to secure the country in terms of the biometric data that's being collected. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul and Kephas, do you have anything to add in terms of the challenges of implementing this biometric system and digital identities from Tanzania and Kenyan experiences? Paul, you can go first.
Yeah, sure. So maybe the only thing I would add is also looking at what is the best biometric to use based on different use cases. So experiences I recall in Tanzania is within farming communities, when they rolled out the SIM registration, there was a lot of issues with actually doing the fingerprint matching with farmers. Good thing is that all 10 fingerprints were collected during data collection. So if I recall correctly, most farmers, the pinky finger actually had the highest match rate with the ID authority, because I suppose it's the finger that was least used for hand labor, like during hand labor and the different activities that farmers do. So I think picking the right biometric for the right use case. Similarly to Kenya, there was an attempt to also use voice biometric by one of the telcos here, which I don't have any inside data, but I believe it didn't really it didn't take off. So I think also looking at user adoption, the amount of sensitization that you have to do the users that you want to target with these services and solutions. And then I think the third thing, lastly, in terms of looking at the different biometrics you're going to capture, what is their characteristics over time? So fingerprints universally, same fingerprint can be authenticated over a long period of time, but how do you treat things like face? For example, my face today is going to be different from my face in 20 years. So how do you handle these different types of biometrics? Behavioral biometrics evolve over time as you age and things like that. So how do you actually if you're choosing those types of biometric solutions, how do you ensure that the data collection also has to be, it's not a one-time activity. You kind of have to update those data points over time. So yeah, those are the only considerations, not necessarily challenges, but just things to be mindful of if you're deploying or looking to use biometrics.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Kefas, do you have anything to add?
In terms of challenges, of course, for me, the biggest one, well, depending on the capabilities of the implementing entity, as always, infrastructure. Again, there is still cheap infrastructure, or rather affordable infrastructure for biometrics. That goes without saying. But then, if you're looking at it from a scale perspective, from an efficiency, effectiveness perspective, definitely infrastructure costs a lot, particularly for citizen-focused kind of projects. I'm glad Paul mentioned farmers. It reminds me of also farmer registration that happened out here sometime, I think last year or the other year, and how all that data is being kept. Of course, I'll be biased to cybersecurity as well. As Doc had said, basic cyber hygiene, good old standard security and privacy practices are not followed. So in essence, I'm a big advocate for this. Just we need to go back to basics because at the end of the day, biometric is a fancy word, but data is data. Data is data, so it needs foundational protection, both for security and privacy. Probably just one consideration, if I can add, based on what Paul has mentioned. Yes, there are changes that happens with biometric data, because again, you're just really working off of records, records of this data. So where is the opportunity? Where is the opportunity for both operational efficiency and cost considerations when you think about applying AI capabilities to how we are processing and using biometric data, because then there is that opportunity that if you have good models that can then learn and train off of the existing data set for biodata, then we can be able to over time, well, even in the short term, really enhance accuracy, notwithstanding, of course, the other risks that are pretty obvious that comes with AI. But there's a chance we could increase accuracy levels, and there's a chance that that accuracy can then be sustained over a long period of time. Because as humans change, as behavior change, the AI can really adapt to those changes. So again, I guess that's our next level future problems in a sense, but just something to think about.
Thank you. So we are left with like 9 minutes and I want us to be able to cover as much as possible. So now I'm going to throw out the last few questions and anybody can answer. We'll just take one person answering so that we get the most and then, save on time as well. So now we've looked at some of the risks. We've looked at the different types of biometric data and digital identities, how the biometric data is then used to create digital identities. We've talked about briefly some of the use cases and some of the challenges with implementing this. So I guess I'm going to go back to the basics. When we look at data protection, we say that it's important to implement technical and organizational measures to secure the data. We've heard throughout the discussion, you've shared, all the three of you have shared some of the, I could call them organizational measures that different entities can take to ensure that they they protect the biometric data, but can any one of you share from your experience two things? One, how best can organizations that are collecting data, especially the non-regulated entities, how can they minimize the collection of biometric data? And then secondly, what are some of the privacy enhancing technologies that you can recommend organizations to consider if they must collect personal data? Because I'm hearing some use cases where it is not mandatory for them to process biometric data, but they are doing so because it's the new fancy thing that is going on in the market right now. Can anybody chip in and share experience?
Yeah.
Yes, Keifa?
So, as you rightly mentioned, has been mentioned a couple of times before. Someone speaking?
It's you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so if you don't need it, don't collect it. If you do collect it, secure it, right?
Yes.
And if you no longer need it, dispose of it. 3 cardinal rules, right? Let me think. Let me think low level here. We have at least at fingerprint level, right? We have biometric on our laptops, right? You just put your finger on that small scanner somewhere next to your mouse pad, and voila, you've signed into your laptop, same to your phone, same to your iPad, same to your smart TV, etc. Right? Very personal, individual use of biometric. When you go to your office, again, you're not a regulated entity, but your office, you've decided that you're going to have a biometric on the door because you want convenience, you want fanciness, you want to look cool. So you have this template of your staff, employees, maybe a few guests who visit, depending on how much traffic you have. You have this data somewhere, right? I'm sure if you are a 5-man business, you have at least 5 copies of fingerprints that you have to manage. So it doesn't matter whether it's 5 or 1 or 2, still a piece of data, right? But then the question then is, do you really need it, right? As you rightly asked, do you really need to have that biometric entrance or attendance using biometrics, right? While we might argue the balance between business objective and operational goals vis-a-vis security and privacy objectives, I think that is for really each organization, small, startup, medium, etc., regulated or not, to justify, right? And then 2, in terms of the PETs, here is my unpopular opinion around PETs. I think I would really suggest, unless you are really in a context where there is good scale in terms of operations, there's good capability, there's good money or resources, I would really suggest anyone, to don't think of privacy enhancing technology first, right? Here's what I'll suggest from a privacy engineering perspective. How systems are designed and how systems are used, whether it's biometric and any other system in the back end related or connected to it, determines the extent to which biometrics can enhance, support, or infringe upon people's privacy. Yeah. What I mean here is 2 things. Think about design and think about use. Privacy enhancing technologies will come around there, but privacy enhancing technologies are not, these are advanced technologies that you do not want to think about investing unless you really have to. But having said that, of course, I have seen instances where you can still be exercising some form of what we call in data flow governance that sort of picks some techniques and tactics for some of the privacy preserving, enhancing tech without having to invest in pure play technologies, whether it's plug and play or build or bought. And that comes from when you think about, when you're conceptualizing the system, probably your biometric system setup, when you're probably, especially if you're building, right? But I don't think most of us build. But you'd want to think about the design of the setup, and then how everyone else is going to interact with the data that is collected, processed, used, stored, etc. around the data. That would be my popular opinion around that. So I would suggest we tone down on the PETs as a term and really think of, let's think foundational first. Let's think about design, system design and development. Hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for clarifying that privacy enhancing technologies should be the last thing that an organization looks at, because I mean, eventually it does cost money. And thank you for reminding us that the important thing is going back to basics to, understand, do you really need that data? Do you really need biometric data? Because you are increasing your liabilities as an organization and your obligation to comply with more stricter requirements under the law. So thank you so much for putting that out there. So we are pressed with time. I would like us to conclude and to ask the last question. I think, Dr. Nancy, this goes out to you, and then we can have the closing remarks from everybody. So what are some of the advice you can give to policymakers? Because at the end of the day, we're looking at these challenges, we're looking at these obligations that organizations are going to have, and in some cases we don't have guidelines, we don't have policies in place. So you have experience, from the African Union. What are some of the policy considerations that our countries can put into consideration?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I am going to first start off by saying that the African Union currently has quite a few policies and frameworks that are on data privacy and data collection. A really good one that I can think of the top of my head right now is the AU Malabo Convention. So referring to that in terms of policy creation would be great as well. Other things that I think policy makers should consider is the very first thing I always tell people is please, please, please protect the data that you're collecting. If you have to collect the data and you do not want to throw it away, then at the very least, protect the data. So implementing strong data encryption and access controls is a great way to ensure that that data that's being collected is being protected, and also establishing clear regulations on how the data is collected, stored, shared, and deleted. So when we talk about deletion, as some of you might know, it's not always deleted. It's still somewhere in the cloud. It's still somewhere on a server. So just really ensuring the deletion of data that is not necessary. I think the other things that countries need to recognize is promoting transparency and public trust. If the people that you're collecting data from do not trust you, sorry to say, you're going to have more issues having access to that data in some cases, in some legal cases, where we've seen some people actually go after, whether it's countries, go after companies that are collecting data for governments. We're seeing quite a few of those legal suits as well. So ensure that you're promoting transparency and public trust. People that you're collecting data from should always know what you're collecting it for, how it's being stored, how it's going to be kept secure, and then also when you're going to delete it, if you intend to delete it, or if you don't intend to delete it, what you're going to use it for the next at least 50 to 100 years, right? So I think that's also really important to ensure when we're talking about biometric data. Finally, I want to mention something that I've already mentioned, which is really truly considering economic and logistical feasibility. Do you have the money to actually build the infrastructure? If you don't, then perhaps it's time to look at, for example, I really like the example mentioned in the private sector of looking at other ways of collecting biometric data. It doesn't necessarily always have to be fingerprinting. What are some other ways that you can collect the data that you need to do the security work that you need, or to ensure the identities of the people that you're serving? So ensuring that you have enough money in the budget for those things, and also reaching out to partners. I think that's another way to ensure that you have the funding that's needed for these types of things. So I'll pause here, or rather I'll stop here and leave it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Since we are over time, and I'm very sensitive to time, I'm just gonna allow Paul to have some closing remarks on this, and then I will I will do the conclusion. Paul, if you have any comments to add. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try and keep it really quick. So some trends I didn't mention in this local market: contactless capturing of fingerprints, so using the person's mobile phone to scan their own prints for self-enrollment use cases. Something very cool I saw at a conference recently, ATM card, where you can actually capture your fingerprint and it is matched locally on the card. And then it allows the card to be used at an ATM. When you're doing enrollment or authentication, in terms of security, making sure you're doing things like liveness detection or proof of life. So if you're doing a face authentication, a person can't just come with a picture of someone's and have that be matched. So just to make sure that the data subject was actually present when their biometric information was being captured for either for enrollment or for matching. And then lastly, in terms of where we're going with all the different things that are gonna happen with biometrics, I think multimodal, which goes beyond biometric, is gonna be really key. I also personally believe we'll likely be left with behavioral biometrics, because everything else with AI and tools out there is going to be very easy to replicate or reverse engineer. But I think different multimodal approaches are going to become really necessary, especially for highly sensitive, in places where the biometrics are being used for highly sensitive things. I will stop there, and thank you very much for hosting this webinar.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nancy, Paul, and Kavers for taking the time to join this very insightful discussion. Clearly, we have not covered even half of what I thought we would cover. There's still so much to discuss on this topic, and we'll definitely book another session in the future to discuss more. I believe people need to be equipped with this knowledge, because the good thing with data protection laws, they are kind of self-regulatory, instruments where power is given to the data subject to have the last say or the autonomy over their personal data. And I think it is very important for people to understand, especially when we are talking of biometric data, because as you have all shared throughout the webinar, there are so many elements that fall under the umbrella of biometric data. And most people, I think, especially in Africa, they probably think biometric data is just your fingerprint. But as we have all heard throughout this webinar, the range of biometric data is so much broad. And if you have entities, or if you have individuals like, the MCs collecting your biometric and it's just for fun, then you should be able to know what are your rights and be able, to call them out and to be able to, to protect your rights and to protect your biometric data. Because unlike other normal personal data that, it can be changed over time, it's easy. It does not have as a big impact as your biometric data has. So I believe we still have a lot to cover, and we will do that in the near future. So I would like to close today's webinar by thanking you, Dr. Nancy, Paul, and Kefers, for being here with us today and sharing your experience and your knowledge. And from me, on behalf of TPPA, I am Josephina Nshunju, and I would like to thank you for participating, and for all our audience that have been with us throughout this webinar. Thank you for staying until the end. And we didn't get questions, and I think, you know, normally when you don't get questions, it's either people understood a lot or they didn't understand at all. And I'm gonna feel like I'm gonna go with, I think people still need to learn about biometric data. So the door is still open to have further discussion. So thank you so much, and I hope next time when we reach out, you'll be willing to participate in another discussion. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. We've come to the end of our webinar.